because it's the week of Christmas and I just didn't do one. But I will send one out by email or just have it ready for you the next time I'm here. And I won't be here next Sunday. I'll be out of town. I'm going out of town tomorrow, and I won't be back until the following Sunday. So there either won't be Adult Sunday School, or I'll try and find a video for y'all to watch, and I'll let you know by way of the constant contact email which one it's going to be. So we left off last time talking about the kind of height of Buddhism in India under the Emperor Ashoka, or Asok, and how he had a conversion after a particularly terrible battle in which his forces slaughtered many people, and he realized that he was living the wrong way, and unlike his grandfather, who had become a giant, Ashoka decided to convert to Buddhism, and he didn't enforce Buddhism on his Mauryan Empire throughout India, but he did promote Buddhism both within his empire, across the subcontinent, and then he sent out missionaries to the south, to Sri Lanka, where Theravada Buddhism continues to this day, to the east, of course, into places that we now call Burma and Vietnam, but also into China, and then he sent missionaries west also. So there's some reports of missionaries coming into Iran, and maybe as Egypt, Buddhist missionaries. So he really supported Buddhism, but after the Mauryan Empire did not last very long after Ashoka's death. None of his heirs were able to really maintain it, and as that empire began to crumble away, a lot of the support for Buddhism in India began to subside. It still existed in India for quite some time after that, but never with the kind of official support that it had all across the subcontinent during Ashoka's Mauryan Empire. And Ashoka had really brought literacy and writing, had raised that up in India and made that important. So that before his time, the emphasis had been on transmitting knowledge, wisdom, scriptures, whatever, orally, from generation to generation. One generation would tell the next, and it would be passed on orally. But Ashoka had really started a trend towards focusing on literacy and writing. And so we see the Brahmins will write the Vedas down. They'll write the Upanishads down. They'll write the great epics down, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana that we had talked about when we talked about Hinduism. But also the Buddhists, who have been passing on the teachings of the Buddha, have been passing on all of the stuff that we've talked about that makes up the Tipitaka. They finally wrote this down. They're towards the beginning of the 1st century BC. It really is when we see the Pali Canon, the Tipitaka gets written down. But one of the things that happens is when you have an oral culture, it's the duty of the community that maintains that oral culture to also, in a sense, police that oral culture, to say, this is reliable and we're going to pass this on. I mean, it's not even a conscious thing. It's just these stories seem reliable or seem right to us, so these are the ones we pass on to our children. Stories about, say, the Buddha or whatever that don't seem right, or teachings that don't seem to fit, are the ones that just don't get passed on. And if they're not written down, they're forgotten, right? They're lost to time. This is true for every culture. So what happens when we get the writing of the Pali Canon, of the Tipitaka down, is we finally have these written texts that define Buddhist tradition. You know, what has come to be seen as reliable Buddhist tradition. The stories about the Buddha, the teachings that go back to the Buddha, written down. But once we made that change over to a written culture, then anyone who can write can possibly add to it. Just like when it's being passed down orally, anyone who can tell a good story or teach well might add to the tradition, but the difference is you don't have to get the community to buy into it anymore, right? Because it doesn't have to be passed down orally, so you don't have to have people who say, yeah, that's reliable, that's true, I'm going to tell this story, we're going to maintain this story in the Sangha and we're going to pass it down to the next generation. Once somebody writes something down, it's there. And even if one whole generation of the Sangha decides we don't think this is true or good or right, it doesn't matter, because the next generation might come along, find the scroll, read it and say, here's something I'd never thought before. This might be a secret teaching of the Buddha. Well, I don't want to cast aspersions. From the Mahayana perspective, and you may have noticed that I have a little bit of an affinity for the Theravada. We spent so much time on the Theravada tradition. From the Mahayana perspective, they found texts in Sanskrit, which is of course the language that the Brahmins are writing in, that supposedly were the secret teachings of the Buddha. It was just not ready for in those first 300 or 400 years. But now, after the Sangha had had some time to practice the teachings that had been passed down in Pali, now they were ready for these new sutras that were actually secret teachings of the Buddha. And so we get the Mahayana Sutras. The Mahayana Sutras are the ones that are in Sanskrit. So and Mahayana is the largest form of Buddhism, largest school or denomination, however you want to say it, of Buddhism. And because they put so much emphasis on these Sanskrit texts, this is why you've all heard the words of Buddhism, the kind of basic concepts, in Sanskrit and not in the Pali that I've been giving to you for the past month and a half. So instead of Nibbana, it's Nirvana, right? Instead of Kama, it's Karma now. And at first, it's not as if there was a clear break and you had Mahayana and you had Theravada right from the beginning, and they, fought over these texts or disagreed about these texts and they broke off. At first, you just had the Sangha in India, and some members, some bhikkhus or bhikkhunis in the Sangha would read these Sanskrit texts and say, yes, this is good and right and this is true. And others would say, no, it's not in our Pali canon, it's not in the Tipitaka, we don't count it. It's not true. But they would be living in sometimes in the same monastic community, right? So there wasn't a clear split right away. It's more of a gradual split between the Theravada tradition and the Mahayana tradition. And I want to go into for a second why it might have been appealing. And that is that in Theravada Buddhism, if you're not a bhikkhu, or you're not a bhikkhuni, if you're not in the monastic community, there are things that you can do. You can meditate. You can go to a monk and learn about the teachings of the Buddha. You can go and retreat with a monk or with monks. So it's not as if there's nothing Buddhists to do. But even that, especially if you think back to a time when most people are peasants and they don't have time to go on retreats and they don't have the money to do that kind of thing, there's not a whole lot for the Buddhist layperson to do. They can work on their own meditation in the tradition, but they're not going to become an arahant. They're not going to become one who has achieved enlightenment in this life. And in fact, the doctrines, as we've kind of looked at them, of the Buddhist teachings are in some ways, I mean, they run against common sense, and they're hard to grasp. I mean, you know, we talked about this idea of anatta or anatman, no soul, no self. It's a tough thing to wrap your mind around. Most people aren't going to be engaged in doing that. In fact, Ashoka, during his reign, said, instead of trying to spread Buddhism, actual Buddhist teachings in terms of, well, you know, eventually you want to reach Nibbana, eventually you want to attain Nibbana, you want to, you know, engage in these practices of meditation, in which case you lose this sense that there is a self and therefore lose desire and all that kind of thing. Rid yourself of tanha. He knew that that was too much for most people. So he just told the common people, if you live by the 5 precepts, and you remember the 5 precepts, kind of moral rules, right? If you live by the 5 precepts, and if you give to the sangha, and you know, you give to the monks when they come begging, or you support the sangha in whatever way you can, this will gain you merit, and if you achieve enough merit, you'll be born again in a kind of heaven. That's what Ashoka told, you know, the average person. Now, that's not at all the Buddhist teaching, right? But this is difficult stuff, and there's not a whole lot for the lay Buddhists to do in the Theravada tradition. Now, I think that's changed. I don't think that's true anymore. There's much more for lay Buddhists to do in the Theravada. But I think at that time, there wasn't a whole lot for a lay Buddhist to do besides live by the 5 precepts and give to the sangha. That's kind of it. That doesn't really sustain a spiritual life. And it doesn't give you any sense of why you should be living according to this way instead of some other way. And I think this is in part why the Brahmins were able to reassert dominance in India after the time of Ashoka, because they were able to take in all sorts of other practices and incorporate them into this emerging thing that we now call Hinduism, that offered people all sorts of different, lay people all sorts of different ways to be be spiritual and to achieve enlightenment, or at least achieve heaven, or a heaven, or a better rebirth. And again, I think you can see that in the Bhagavad Gita. If you look at the response of Krishna to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, he says, if you just do your dharma, you just do your duty, you'll be reborn. You might even reach moksha, liberation from the cycle of death and rebirth, and enter paradise in that way. The Bhagavad Gita offers many different ways. Devotion to the God, doing your dharma, all sorts of different ways. Buddhism didn't offer as many. I think what Mahayana does is offer the average layperson ways to be Buddhist besides simply supporting the Sangha and living by the 5 precepts. And so let's kind of dive into it real quick. What's the time looking like, by the way?
16.
Okay. And when we come back when I come back, on January 12th, we'll have a guest speaker, my friend Josh, who's an American lay practitioner, and he's within the Mahayana, and probably draws from the Vajrayana tradition. So you'll get more of this from him, and it might be a little clearer.
Are we going to talk about the relationship to Zen at some time?
We will. Okay. Yeah, that's where we're going to end up at. There, eventually, so Zen is part of Mahayana Buddhism. We have to lay the groundwork before we can get into the specific branches. So Mahayana, there's a sutra, a Mahayana sutra called the Lotus Sutra, and it comes to understand the relationship to the older traditions, like the Theravada tradition, in this way. In the Lotus Sutra, it says that there was a man, and he comes home and he finds his house is on fire, and inside are his children. And his children are playing, and they're not even noticing the fire. And so he tries to get them to come out. No, why are we going to come out? We're having a good time inside. Why would we come outside? So then he says, well, if you come outside, I've got gifts for you. I've got a cart for each of you. I guess back then a cart sounds like a lot of fun, right? So he says, I've got a cart for each one of you. If you just come out, you can play with it. Well, they don't come out because they're going to be burned to death. They come out because they have carts to play in now. But when they get out, each seeking their own cart, and these represent, in the Mahayana tradition, the 3 earlier traditions that come before Mahayana, which we haven't talked about all 3, but you might think of these as the distinct pathways that end up as Theravada. They come out, and he says, actually, I lied. It's an okay lie, right? Because he saved their lives. But what he really has for them is one nice, big, giant ox cart for them all to travel in. And the point of the story is that Mahayana is the one big, giant ox cart. You might take the Theravada tradition, one of the ancient traditions. You might think that that's the way out, but actually in the end, it's the Mahayana, the great ox cart that will take you to enlightenment, to the other shore. And so you see this kind of sense that they've gone beyond this earlier tradition that's encapsulated in the Pali canon of Theravada Buddhism. And in fact, traditionally, Mahayana Buddhists have called Theravada Hinayana. Mahayana means great vehicle. Hinayana means puny little vehicle. Right? Now, it's not like there's a bunch of fighting between Mahayana and Theravada, and they actually get together, and at one of the big kind of meetings in the 20th century, the Theravada Buddhists said, look, you can't call us Hinayana. You just got to stop that. Call us Theravada, the way of the elders. That's what we call ourselves. We'll call you Mahayana because that's what you call yourselves. And so that's, as far as I know, that's the terminology that's preferred. Okay. So one of the differences is that in these Mahayana sutras, it actually says that there's, and I can't remember which sutra, and I can't remember the name of the guy, and I apologize for that. I'll look it up later. But there's a story about a layperson, not a bhikkhu, not a monk, not an ascetic, who lived at the time of the Buddha, whose teaching was second only to the Buddha's. And so the Buddha would often send his disciples in this Mahayana Sutra. The Buddha would send his disciples to this layperson to learn from him. So these Buddhist bhikkhus who had given up everything, who are arahants, and yet they have to go learn from this layperson who hasn't given up anything. Right? Well, why is that the case? It's the case because this layperson was a bodhisattva. He was one on the pathway to enlightenment, to nirvana, but forestalling it so that he could teach others. And this is the main and kind of important point for Mahayana, which is that in the Theravada tradition, the goal is ultimately to become a bhikkhu so that you can dedicate your life to the long, hard practice of meditation, to cultivate the mind so that you can become an arahant, one who has reached nirvana and will, when you die, attain parinirvana without remainder. You won't be reborn again. That's the goal in Theravada. It's very individualistic in that sense, even though Theravada still upholds compassion as an important aspect of mind cultivation. Sympathy and compassion are still important, but ultimately you're seeking your own blowing out, your own nibbana in the Theravada tradition. In Mahayana, the ideal is not the arahant, but the bodhisattva. Now, if you recall in the Jataka, the stories about the Buddha that are in the Pali Canon from when he was remembering his past lives, he is called in those stories a bodhisattva. That's the Pali word. The Sanskrit word is bodhisattva. And what the Mahayana text says is anybody. They don't have to be a bhikkhu. They don't have to be a monk or a nun. Anybody can be a bodhisattva. Potentially anybody can be a bodhisattva. And in fact, you could be. You just have to start on the pathway of the bodhisattva. And to do that, you make this vow. This is the bodhisattva vow. You say, sentient beings are numberless. I vow to liberate them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to transcend them. Dharma teachings are boundless. I vow to master them. The Buddha's enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Now, this may take you thousands of lives, but if you've started on the bodhisattva path, you will one day attain nirvana. And you will, instead of entering parinirvana, that is, not being reborn, you will forestall that until you can save all other beings. That's the path of the Bodhisattva. And we'll talk about at another time some of the different Bodhisattvas. I'd like to get into that, but I don't think we've got the time. There's one other, so let me just say this. So suddenly compassion becomes much more important in the Mahayana tradition. Again, it's not unimportant in Theravada, but it becomes, in a sense, the highest ideal in the Mahayana tradition. Not attaining nirvana, but forestalling the attainment of parinirvana so that you can save others. That becomes the highest ideal, your compassion. And that will change the way they think about the Buddhist teachings. There's one other thing that I want to mention. How are we doing on time?
It's 7 minutes still.
Okay, so this is the very last thing that I'm going to mention, and I won't be able to go into it. The Mahayana tradition develops the concept of sunyata, or emptiness. And we've already seen that in the Buddhist teachings we have anicca, or impermanence. All things are impermanent. And we've seen anatta, there's no self, no soul. Right? We're just the coming together of the 5 khandhas and drawn together by our karma. This takes it even further, so that everything is emptiness. It's not just that it's impermanent, it's that everything is emptiness. And we'll have to wait and look at how that changes. I think Josh will probably get into this. How that changes, again, the way that they understand the relationship between a Buddha and someone trapped in samsara, right? Because Buddha is nothingness, is emptiness, samsara is emptiness, okay? And so the difference collapses at that point. Remember the first noble truth, all life is dukkha, right? Is suffering. But suffering is emptiness. And from this Mahayana perspective, and escape from suffering is emptiness. Nirvana is emptiness. So I'm going to end by reading you the Heart Sutra, which is very short. And this will give you a sense of both the Bodhisattva and sunyata, or emptiness. I think this is a condensed version of it. I hope I can pronounce this Bodhisattva's name. I'm not even going to try it. So this Bodhisattva, who I'm going to talk about next time, and I'll work on pronouncing his name, practicing deep prajna paramita, clearly saw that 5 skandhas are empty, transforming all suffering and distress. Form is no other than emptiness. Emptiness no other than form. Form is exactly emptiness. Emptiness exactly form. Sensation, thought, impulse are all like this. All things are marked by emptiness, not born, not destroyed, not stained, not pure, without gain, without loss. Therefore in emptiness there is no form, no sensation, thought, impulse, consciousness, no eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind, no color, sound, smell, taste, touch, object of thought, no realm of sight to no realm of thought, no ignorance and also no ending of ignorance, to no old age and death and also no ending of old age and death, no suffering, also no source of suffering, no annihilation, no path, no wisdom, also no attainment, having nothing to attain. Bodhisattvas live prajna paramita, with no hindrance in the mind, no hindrance, thus no fear. Far beyond delusive thinking, they attain complete nirvana. All Buddhas, past, present, and future, live prajna paramita, and thus attain perfect awakened enlightenment. Therefore, know that Prajnaparamita is the great mantra, the wisdom mantra, the unsurpassed mantra, the supreme mantra, which completely removes all suffering. There is truth. This is truth, not deception. Therefore, set forth the Prajnaparamita mantra. Set forth this mantra and say, Gate, Gate, Paragate, Parasamgate, Bodhisattva. So that's the Heart Sutra. And notice all is emptiness, and we're going to have to end there.